Good morning, everybody. I am, does this sound a bit odd? Does it sound okay? Yeah. I'm approaching this topic from the vantage point of a journalism scholar who's interested in media coverage of disasters. And specifically, I'm interested in how the coverage of disasters inevitably comes to be about political questions. So that is, I'm interested in how through media coverage, the meanings of disasters are constructed and how they come to politically matter in terms of larger questions of citizenship and governance in local, national, and global contexts. And so the work that I've done has actually looked mainly at the coverage of different types of disasters, and as part of that, I've looked a little bit at the earthquake and tsunami and also the nuclear disaster following those. And what I'm going to argue is that in the case of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami and nuclear disaster, the coverage was actually very distinctive compared to that of other disasters that I've examined. And I looked at the reporting of the disaster in major English language newspapers. So actually saying that I'm looking at media is a bit overstating the case, but I've looked at newspaper coverage in particular. And what I'll talk to you about a little bit today is some of the patterns that I encountered in the 2 weeks following the initial earthquake, and then again in the coverage during 1 week after each of the anniversaries in 2012 and 2013. And what I'm going to suggest is that the initial reports immediately following the disaster tended to follow broader trends that we've discerned in the coverage of disasters because they tended to focus on the horror of the events and the grief of the victims. But then very quickly, the focus of the coverage shifted to actually frame the disaster in terms of the geopolitical importance of Japan, including the ways in which the event would actually impact on the global economy. And also, relating to this, it fed into debates over nuclear risk. Then we also saw a series of constructions of Japan as a technologically advanced and very independent nation, and what I perceive to be very essentialist discourses on Japanese stoicism and resilience, which all contributed to an emphasis on understanding the disaster in terms of primarily its consequences for the global economy and the international community, rather than what you more typically see in disaster coverage, which is an emphasis on the plight of the victims and suffering of victims of the disaster. And by contrast, what I would suggest is that when you look at the anniversary coverage, that tended to frequently draw on the experiences of victims and survivors and those who had been displaced by the disaster, but ultimately also contributed to raising larger questions about nuclear risk in a global context. I should say that I've only looked at newspapers here, and that is something that is highly convenient for research purposes as a means of accessing the key ways in which public debate unfolds in specific national and also global contexts, and also looking at the ways in which the meanings of particular disaster come to be fixed and indexed to broader social issues such as discussions over nuclear risk. At the same time, newspaper coverage should also be understood within an increasingly complex and evolving media landscape. And this is something I think Professor Tanaka is going to talk to us about next when he talks about the usefulness, among other things, of social media in terms of providing information in this case. What other researchers looking at Fukushima and media coverage have found is that there was an unprecedented deluge of online information available about this incident, so that, for example, about 4 months following the disaster, one person who looked at this got more than 73 million search results in Google on Fukushima and 22 million results on Fukushima and radiation. And then at the same time, we should also remember that television actually remains the most important source of news for audiences. But in terms of understanding the ways in which disasters make a difference to political debate, newspapers continue to provide a very useful and also convenient source of information, which is also something that's very easily comparable across time and across different types of disasters. And this is something that myself and my colleagues have looked at extensively. We've carried out a systematic analysis of thousands of reports on 5 different man-made disasters, what we call man-made disasters, spanning 5 decades. And as Nick Pigeon pointed out yesterday, questions around the distinction between man-made and natural disasters is actually a very tenuous one, and I'll get into more detail about this later as well. But what we found there was that the initial coverage of disaster always tends to focus on the actual horrific events and on the experiences and emotions of the victims, and that tends to be a pattern that broadly dominates coverage within at least the first week after the initial incident. And then you get a turn to more political questions about who's responsible for any wrongdoing. So for example, in the case of the big earthquake in Sichuan in China in 2008, you got stories about school collapses and who's responsible for these school collapses. When there was a big earthquake in Haiti in 2010, you got a lot of stories about the legacy of post-colonialism and how that had left the country impoverished and unable to deal with the consequences of the disaster. We subsequently found that this pattern, in other words, of a strong focus on the horrific events and a strong focus on the experiences of the victims is not only something you see with the case of man-made disasters, but also with so-called natural disasters. And if we look at the coverage of the earthquake in Japan, you get the very same pattern in the first 2 days of a strong focus on things like communicating very basic information about the scale of the destruction. You get stories about the plight of victims who have lost their families and lost their homes, and you get very graphic images of the destruction as well. But what was very striking here, I just want to give you an example of some of this coverage. This is from the Australian Advertiser, talking about it, the tsunami here as an unstoppable nightmare. And so this is quite a common theme, that you get this uncontrollable force of nature against which human beings are helpless, and also all of the creations of human beings, like buildings and technologies, are essentially helpless, and we cannot do anything about this. Now, after this initial coverage, which focused on horror and on grief and on emotional tales of loss among the victims, the coverage actually shifted very, very quickly to trying to interpret the broader political importance of the event. And it is striking in this case, as I'll get on to discussing in a moment, how very quickly this occurred. In the case as in the case of other disasters, the coverage focused very much on situating the event in terms of its relevance to the respective home countries of the publications that we studied, and particular in terms of their significance with respect to broader geopolitical dynamics. So I want to just briefly explain what I mean by this. Well, the field of critical geopolitics, it's a field within geography, looks at power relations between different nation states. So they suggest that the ways in which we talk about politics and the ways in which we talk about world events reflects complex and dynamic global power relations, and don't simply have to do with the nation state itself. And so we take this interest in dynamic global power relations and think about it as an opportunity to look at how disaster coverage actually constructs relations among countries and between countries, and among regions. And this might sound a little bit abstract, but in fact, it is something that ties in with very pragmatic considerations on the part of news organizations, because questions about what kinds of countries matter, what kinds of victims matter, these kinds of questions are very important for news organizations who have to decide how to allocate resources such as reporters on the ground and equipment in terms of covering particular events. And also they have to decide on how to frame particular events, how to make them relevant to their home audiences, and how to prioritize these events within news agendas. And these kinds of decisions are routinely made on the basis of assessments of news values, what is actually going to make for good news stories. These kinds of assessments involve what scholars of disasters have called a crude calculus of death. So, for example, journalism scholars who have studied how newsrooms deal with disasters suggest that there are these very crude and kind of tongue-in-cheek calculations about what actually makes a disaster newsworthy. So, for example, 1 European is equivalent to 28 Chinese deaths, is one such calculation, or 2 Welsh miners is worth the same as 1,000 Pakistanis. And you often see this illustrated very dramatically in media coverage of disasters, as was the case in the initial coverage, I think, of the Asian tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami, when you saw stories that had a headline saying something like 10,000 dead and 1 British toddler missing. And this is quite a common kind of pattern. But you also get, these calculations are more complex than thinking merely about a calculus of death. Very important issues have to do with the perceived cultural and geographical proximity of the nation. So if a disaster happens next door, it's probably going to be higher on the news agenda than one that occurs in a distant place that we haven't ever heard about. And similarly, assessment of the importance of the nation where it occurs are very crucial in terms of shaping news coverage. So this type of decision making is highly pragmatic, as news organizations have to carefully deploy limited and technological human resources. And what's also important to bear in mind is precisely the fact that disasters are unpredictable, more or less. And that means that news organizations will only very rarely have staff and technological resources on the ground when a disaster actually strikes. This is a map of the incidence of disasters from the ICRC. It's from a few years back, I think 2008 to 2009, which is the last time they actually produced this kind of data. But the patterns revealed here are fairly stable, and as this map and this chart suggests, disasters are usually something that for audiences in the global north tend to happen far away in distant countries and regions in the global south. So media scholars suggest that whatever is foreign and far away tends to be constructed in the media of the global north anyways as a place of kind of violence, conflict, danger, disaster, underdevelopment, and poverty. And disaster coverage is no exception from this rule. And along those lines, the victims of disasters tend to be constructed as poor and distant sufferers who are worthy of compassion. Now, with respect to this, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster in Japan was actually covered in a very distinctive way. So following this initial focus on the grief of victims and the horror of the events, other more, what I would interpret as being more geopolitically inflected ways of covering the event came into play, which actually challenged or departed ways with dominant ways of covering disaster. First of all, there was a whole slew of articles which tried to justify the kind of reluctance of Western donors to step in and help in terms of the perceived self-sufficiency and stoicism of Japan. So Japan was constructed as this technologically advanced and independent nation, and you get a series of these very kind of what I would say are very stereotypical representations of the stoic nature of the Japanese people, who are then seen as kind of these very self-sufficient but also somewhat exotic and distant others. And so in the sample that I looked at, which had about 6,500 stories, 208 of them used the word stoic to describe the actions of the Japanese people. And this was not unique to newspaper coverage. It was also something that you saw in television coverage. But another very important and distinctive frame in the coverage, and this is something that came up over and over again and was extremely salient, included a consideration of the ways in which the disaster would affect the very ailing, the very troubled global economy. And this was a major theme. I searched for this in various different ways. The idea, the term market was mentioned in more than 1,800 articles in major world newspapers in the 2 weeks following the disaster, or that's 28% of all the stories covering the disaster. The term economic consequences was used in more than 1,600 stories. So it was clearly a major theme in the coverage because the disaster was seen to affect everything from stock markets and the sale of smartphones to automobile manufacturing in Japan and elsewhere. And to some extent, this was a way of making local audiences relate to the disaster. So this is something that journalists will always do. They will always try to tell stories in a way that resonates with the local audiences. And it was also at the same time, when you have this very strong focus on economic consequences, in a way it also takes away from any attention to the plight of the victims. And this story is from the Daily Telegraph, and that's just 3 days after the earthquake. And already here the journalist is admitting that it might seem faintly distasteful, if not even perverse, to think about the economic consequences, but at the same time it's important for us to think about that. So we're going to go right ahead and speculate on the economic consequences because it's so important for us here. And this was a very, very common way of framing it. Now, the unfolding nuclear disaster became increasingly salient in media coverage when it became increasingly clear that the Fukushima nuclear plant was threatened by a meltdown. And this is evident from a very cursory glance at just the volume of coverage in the first 3 days after the disaster, and then in the last 3 days of the 2-week period following the disaster. So you see here obviously somewhat of a decrease in the amount of coverage in the second period, but a significant increase in terms of the coverage of the nuclear risk. And at the same time, what you also see is that a substantial amount of this coverage actually focused not on covering the nuclear disaster itself, but once again on the consequences for global economic markets. So stories would often be about how investors were concerned about what was going on in Japan, and therefore international stock markets were rattled. So once again, the focus was not on the experience of the victims of disaster, but rather on the global economic consequences. And this is something that's evident. If you look at, I looked at articles on the search terms Japan and earthquake and nuclear. That is very much framed in terms of global economic consequences. And the headlines that I've put up here are simply based on using those search terms. I picked out the headlines of article number 10, 20, and 30. So it's a completely random selection of articles that were not specifically about the market, but were about Japan, the Japan earthquake and nuclear. And so all of these stories that come up are basically about economic consequences. At the same time, within this coverage, you also do get fairly widespread coverage of the resulting public debates around the world over nuclear risk. So you got debates in the, for instance, Canadian and South African and British press as well about concerns within these countries about nuclear risk as a result of the Fukushima disaster. Now, Keplinger, a German scholar who carried out a content analysis of the Fukushima disaster in German, British, French, and Swiss media, actually found significant differences between these countries. So he's done this much more systematically than I have, and I think his findings are very interesting. And in Germany, where there has been a long-standing debate on nuclear risk and a strong anti-nuclear movement, and where the Fukushima disaster in part led to the promises of decommissioning of nuclear plants in Germany. In Germany, you got very, very heavy coverage, and also this coverage was very quickly connected to the risk associated with the nuclear industry in the country. And these kinds of connections were not at all made in Britain and in France, where you also saw much less coverage of the nuclear disaster than you did in Germany. So Keplinger ruled out other intervening variables such as distance from Japan or the safety of nuclear plants in the respective countries, and he concluded that national public debates and emergent perspectives on nuclear power seem to play a key role in terms of actually shaping media coverage. So what I think is interesting to consider then here is also the long-standing legacy of the disaster in terms of debates on nuclear energy in a global context. And what I thought it would be interesting to look at then is the disaster coverage, the coverage of the anniversaries of this disaster. Because researchers who have looked at things like commemorations and anniversaries have found that these kinds of events, first of all, are often heavily emotional. So the journalism scholar Karin Kitsch has written about what she calls memorial journalism as a news of feeling as well as of fact. And she suggests that when you have an anniversary for an event, it often focuses on the feelings and memories of survivors and of victims. But at the same time, if you look specifically at anniversary coverage of disasters, that also tends to always be placed in a political context. And scholars who have studied this suggest that it tends to focus on things like lessons that we've learned from this disaster, things like attributions of responsibility, who's actually responsible for any wrongdoing, but also judgments of preventability of future disasters. And I think what was interesting here was the extent to which questions about nuclear risk actually came up in the anniversary coverage in 2012 and 2013. I looked at a week following each of the two anniversaries, but discovered very quickly that actually only the first 2 days after each of the anniversaries had coverage that focused specifically on the anniversaries, and then the anniversary came to be mentioned in a broader context. So if you look at the first 2 days, what you get is a very strong emphasis, as Karin Kitsch would have predicted it, on the feelings and the experiences of the survivors. And then in both years also you get a series of very critical stories on the rebuilding and nuclear cleanup, and things like the relocation of people and the experiences of people who have been dislocated. But then within that you also get a fair bit of coverage of nuclear risk, and that only seems to be increasing in 2013. And then you also get still some stories about consequences for the economy. So To some extent, actually, just going back here again, one thing that's interesting about the anniversary coverage is that to some extent it actually enabled a kind of focus on the experiences of the victims and the survivors of the disaster, which you didn't actually see as much as you would typically expect in a disaster when the initial event occurred. So you got a much larger proportion of stories that talked about the emotions of victims, the feelings of victims, and the personal stories of victims than you did when the initial disaster occurred. So to some extent, you could say that the anniversary coverage really focused on events on the ground and didn't always tend to place so much of an emphasis on domesticating the story or on making it relevant to local audiences. It was seen as being relevant in its own right as an anniversary of this major event. And as a result of that, in the first couple of days, it wasn't so strongly placed in the context of these broader global debates. However, once you move into the week-long period after the anniversary, you get a much more politicized form of coverage, where again you get the event located within a geopolitical context and also within the context of debates going on in the home countries. So within a week of each of the anniversaries, you got a very large number of stories on a range of different issues to do with nuclear risk. Some of these had to do with things like protests in Japan and also the radiation fears of survivors on the ground in Japan, for example. But you also get stories about nuclear protests in other places, including the UK and in Turkey. And you get discussions around nuclear policy. And these discussions tend to be very much placed within, or they tend to use the anniversary as a context which provides a kind of cautionary note for any report that talks about the debates over nuclear and really a way of emphasizing the dangers of nuclear power. So in other words, the anniversary of the disaster comes to be mobilized as a way of cautioning against the dangers of nuclear power. And I think actually if you look now at any kind of random piece of media coverage that mentions the Fukushima disaster in any other context, it will be used in that kind of framework. So just to try to conclude then, what I tried to argue here is that disaster coverage in newspapers in particular tends to in general be profoundly shaped by geopolitical considerations. Disasters mostly take place in the global south, where victims tend to be constructed as these poor and exotic and distant sufferers. But by contrast, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster was characterized by these very distinctive patterns which took seriously Japan's place in the global geopolitical environment and tended to minimize an emphasis on the suffering of victims, which is otherwise something that's a very salient theme in coverage. And it also started to consider questions of nuclear risk. And these questions, I would suggest, became further politicized in the anniversary coverage, ultimately demonstrating their salience for global debates over nuclear risk. Thank you.